Every country needs its legends, but sometimes the legends get so big that it swallows the truth whole. Welcome back to The Historians, the series here on the History Shorts where I sit down with two leading historians for an unscripted conversation about the questions that have shaped how we understand our past. For this episode, I sat down with two of the foremost authorities on the American Wild West. Paul Andrew Hutton is a distinguished professor of history at the University of New Mexico, a six-time winner of the Western Writers of America Spur Award, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Undiscovered Country. He's written, narrated, or appeared in over 200 television documentaries and has spent his career telling the full, unvarnished story of the American West. Lee Gardner is the best-selling author of Rough Riders, Shot All the Hell, and To Hell on a Fast Horse. His YouTube video answering questions about the Wild West has been viewed nearly 6 million times, and he's appeared on the hit Netflix docuseries Wyatt Earp and the Cowboy War. At the core of this conversation, I asked them one question: how wild was the Wild West? What followed was a conversation about the gap between legend and history, the outlaws whose myths outgrew their actual lives, the figures history remembers wrong, the ones it's forgotten entirely, and what Hollywood got right and what it got very, very wrong. They didn't always agree on everything, but that's exactly what made this whole thing worth listening to. This is The Historians. Pull up a chair and enjoy today's episode. Paul, Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So, Paul, I'll start with you first, and then we'll go to Mark. But what got you interested in this particular time period and geographical area in American history?
Well, I was a history professor for 48 years, and Western history had always fascinated me. I blame it all on Walt Disney. Walt Disney's Davy Crockett, which I saw as a small child, captivated me and led to my interest in the West. I always wanted to be a historian. I always wanted to be a writer, and I figured I needed a day job just as backup. So went to graduate school, got a PhD, became a professor. Recently, I've gotten out of that racket and am the curator of the Buffalo Bill Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. And we now live in Cody after 40 years in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the University of New Mexico.
Awesome. Mark?
Yeah, I grew up in Northwest Missouri. I was born in Missouri and in the heart of Jesse James country. The first historic site I can remember as a child visiting was the house in St. Joseph where Jesse was killed. I was miles from Civil War battlefields, from the Oregon-California Trail starting point, the starting point of the Santa Fe Trail, just an area that was really steeped in Western history. And as I got older, I was so fascinated by the fact that so many of these legendary characters were from my state. They were from Missouri, or at least started there, whether it was Kit Carson or what have you. So that, and then of course, my dad was a logger. He cut timber, self-employed, walnuts, maples, but he'd always make sure in the summer to take off like 10 days or 2 weeks and take me and my two sisters and my mom on a vacation. And, my dad, he'd only got to the 8th grade when he had to start working for my granddad in the woods. And my mom had me when she was 17. So these vacations were education, not just for the kids, but for them also. And we hit every historic site and battlefield in the West. And then in my college years, I worked summers for the National Park Service. I was a living history interpreter for 3 summers at Bent's Fort in Colorado and 1 summer at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. And then later I continued in public history. I was a director of a historic site on the Santa Fe Trail in Southern Colorado. And when my wife became pregnant with our first child, I decided I'll be a house dad and I'll try to get some jobs writing. And it all kind of started from there. I've been a freelance historian ever since, more than 30 years now.
So, guys, Hollywood basically invented the version of the West that most people think they know about the West. How far off is that popular image from what you found through decades of historical research?
Well, I would argue that, in fact, it was the namesake of my museum, William F. Cody, who really did invent what we call the Wild West. And certainly, if we want to look at literary origins, we can go back to Fenimore Cooper. We can read Francis Parkman. I mean, there was a lot of Western history floating around, but Cody created the conventions that we identify with Western film and television, and even Western fiction, in his Wild West exhibition. And it ran for 30 years in the United States and all through Europe. And it really created the image of America for all the millions of immigrants coming into America, and also for Europeans. So the Western film, which comes right at the time that Cody's Arena show is about to close, it went bankrupt in 1913, and then he tried his hand at motion pictures. It followed those conventions, and if you want to know history, read a book. If you want to be entertained, go to the movies. And there is an intersection between history and film, and the Western film thrives on its connection to history, but it's not history by any stretch of the imagination. So, and it's a fun parlor game to play, to point out all the things that are wrong, but it gets tiresome pretty quickly because almost everything's wrong historically. The greatest Western film I believe ever made is The Searchers. They're supposed to be in Texas. They're in Monument Valley. Who cares? I mean, it's the quality of the story. It's the film that works, in terms of storytelling. And filmmakers always say, "Oh, there's a greater truth." Well, yeah, there is.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I have always found it puzzling why people spend so much time, wanting to pick out the anachronisms of a film. I mean, they're movies. It's another reality, and I enjoy those other realities. And kind of a guide that I use is that if I'm noticing anachronisms, it's not a very good movie. But if those things disappear, whether it's Dances with Wolves or The Search, if it's a great story that's well told, then it's a great movie. I don't care. I watched what is that latest Kevin Costner? What is it called? The Horizon?
Oh,
What is
the
it?
long one.
Horizon.
Yeah,
I think so.
I really like that. And there were all kinds of errors in there, but I was kind of glued to it. So I'm just not one of those people where it drives me nuts to find everything that's wrong. It's another reality. It's not history. See if you can enjoy it.
Yeah, I think there's also an important aspect to this because if you take that away, how often does a younger person go to a library these days and pick out a book, right, about the West? If too many people, they get exposed to the stories through cinema or through 1950s, Gunsmoke or something along those lines, right? Where that's what draws them in initially. And then from there, hopefully you would hope someone would be like, oh, I want to know more. And then they go out. Unfortunately, they don't start in the library these days. And if you so they just came out with American Primeval. I haven't seen it on Netflix last year, but apparently, my son said, "Oh, Dad, it was really good," and I never would expect him to watch something that deals with the West. So I think there is a role for Hollywood to play in disseminating history, I guess.
Popular culture almost always is the first stop on someone's interest in history. And so in my case, I mean, I saw Disney Davy Crockett, and then even as a small child, I went to the library and I read it. I started reading everything I could on not just Crockett, but Texas, the Alamo, that whole period. Then Andrew Jackson, off we went to the races, and you just kind of build on that. And so I applaud film for inspiring people to hopefully learn more. Most people don't, of course.
Yeah.
And in fact, their knowledge base is the movie they saw, and these movies can have incredible influence. I mean, certainly Little Big Man, a satirical Western made in 1970 entirely changed the image of Custer into this kind of maniacal fool, that he still holds that reputation today because of the power of that film, at least for that generation. Now, there were other forces at work as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can't underestimate the influence. Sometimes it's good, it sparks interest, and other times it's very detrimental because many of these films, take a very ideological stand that is counter to the truth of the period they're portraying, and frankly, I think to the truth of history.
Yeah. And there's always a love story. There has to be a love story.
Yeah, as was the problem for Costner's Horizon. He didn't have much of a love story there.
So when you start thinking, you guys have both written about so many larger than life figures. Can you think of a person from your standpoint that you think history has just gotten completely wrong?
This is going to be surprising, but this person overrated. I'm going to qualify and say overrated as a gunfighter because that's the way this person has been portrayed. But I'm going to say Doc Holliday. I mean, he's a fascinating individual and he deserves the attention. But he's been portrayed in films and as this dead-eye shot, and even in his own lifetime, he was supposedly had killed a dozen people, and really the only confirmed that we can say for sure that he was responsible for was Tom McClary at the OK Corral gunfight, and he killed him with a shotgun. It wasn't a revolver. So yeah, I think as a gunfighter, he's highly overrated. As a fascinating character, a dentist, an alcoholic, a gambler, best friend of Wyatt Earp, definitely deserves all the attention. But he's often in film. He's this quick shot, quick draw, master marksman. Just look at Val Kilmer, right? So
yeah, literally, that's what I thought about the second you said that.
It's fascinating too how Holliday kind of takes over all of the films about Wyatt Earp. He's a far more interesting character, and I would argue that in fact Wyatt Earp is just highly overrated. Not that he didn't live a fascinating life, not that he wasn't a lawman in the West, not that the OK Corral has become a seminal moment, but to make him into the very symbol of law in the West when, Mark, of course, just wrote this wonderful book about Holliday and Earp. I mean, that's like a bridge too far. And a lot of that comes out of Hollywood, of course. And a book like what Mark's just written, of course, is kind of a corrective, but at the same time, he spins a great story because it is a great story. And I'm sure Mark will acknowledge that we owe a debt of gratitude to Stuart Lake and Walter Noble Burns for starting a couple of characters that we both built a career around, Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid, because they wrote really important books in the 1930s that established these characters. And what's fascinating about them is that they're very much 20th century characters. They were notorious in their own time, sort of. Billy the Kid more than Wyatt Earp, but boy, it really is the power of the pen, and then of course Hollywood. Both Wyatt Earp and especially Billy the Kid have been the subject of innumerable films, and with no end in sight.
Yeah. I mean, it took literature and film to make these guys icons. They weren't icons before Walter Noble Burns and these movies, but they were after. So,
can you guys think of a character that when you started your research years ago, that you kind of felt like you almost rediscovered? That this person has always been around, but they never really got enough play. They never get enough moment in the in the limelight. But for you, you're like, the more I research, this person pops up, and this figure stayed with you, where you kind of feel like you want to bring them more to the surface throughout your career.
Well, in my book, in the Undiscovered Country, I use 7 lives to tell the story of the American West and intertwine them from 1755 to 1900, Boone, Crockett, Carson, Cody, Red Eagle, leader of the Creeks, Maggots, Colorados, of the Apaches, and Sitting Bull of the Lakotas. Buffalo Bill Cody is the most influential of those in terms of his impact upon American and world culture. But Kit Carson is the most important, and Kit Carson is the most underrated character in all of Western history. And now, of course, he's pilloried, especially down in New Mexico, by ignorant people. And you can't debate. I refuse to debate with these people anymore. I mean, they don't know what they're talking about. And he was, on the Santa Fe Trail. He's a mountain man. He's the guide for Fremont. He's a hero in the conquest of California. He's an Indian agent and an Indian fighter in New Mexico. He's a Civil War general who helps to stop the rebel invasion of the Southwest. I mean, just a fascinating character he's like the Forrest Gump, of Western history, but he's also important. I mean, in what he does, incredibly famous in the 19th century, but kind of faded and then became infamous again, really out of New Mexico because of an obsession with the Navajo War and the terrible consequences of Bosque Redondo, where the Navajo, after Carson defeated them, were relocated to, but he had nothing to do with Bosque Redondo. So it's just a strange case of the triumph of ignorance over history.
The person I think of is actually a contemporary of Carson's, and I wanted to do a book about him, but I could not convince any of the major publishers to do it. But it's Jim Beckwourth. Beckwourth is his father is a slave owner. His mother is the slave of his father. So he's born into slavery. He's raised as the child. It's acknowledged the child of this white man. But he's eventually freed by his father. He's with the Ashley expedition and goes west in the fur trade. He has this incredible. I mean, he's like Jack Crabb, a little big man. He's everywhere. He's in the California gold rush. He discovers Beckwourth Pass. He lives with the Crow Indians and becomes one of their leaders and fights with them. And at the very end of his career, he's an Army scout, and he leads Colorado troops to Sand Creek, to Black Kettle's village. He worked for Bent St. Vrain and Company as a trader. I mean, and what's amazing about Beckwourth is that he is known. It's just that he's not of the stature of Kit Carson. In 1856, he had his semi-autobiography was published, his life and adventures. You'll get acknowledgments, or he'll show up in a documentary or a minor character in a book. But I just am amazed that he is not as well known today as he should be.
You should start a podcast on this. Why not?
Yeah.
Or do like a video, right? I mean, or write an article. That's always my thing. Because if I'm thinking of a book that doesn't get picked up, I'm like, I want to tell this story. What can I do? Which is why we even met, guys, because that's how the podcast started. I'm like, I really like this story, but I don't want to spend 5 years on it. So it's like, all right, maybe I'll do an article. But then I'm like, I don't know if I want to spend months on this either. So, all right, I'll spend a couple of days, review it, and make a podcast show out of it. And here we are. You know what? The big question for our meeting today, for me, I'm always like fascinated with this question of just how wild was the Wild West, right? That's the big question, right? How violent was or perhaps maybe wild and violent are not the same thing. But if we had to ask, how wild was the Wild West? And perhaps we'll start with the violence aspect. How violent was it? Was it as violent as we see it portrayed, where everywhere you go, there's just duels and everyone's just walking around shooting people? If we could maybe pick up with that concept.
Well, people preceded the law. And so the pioneers, of course, had to create the law on each of the successive frontiers as they moved across the country. So, I mean, it was lawless. Was it as violent as, New York City was in the 1870s and 80s or is today? No, it was not. But then there were hardly any people. If you live in, Dodge City, Kansas, and 5 people are killed during the year, oh my God, what is going on? I mean, you've only had several hundred, people in your community. So it has to do with perspective. For many years, academic historians, of which I belong to that tribe, spent a lot of time trying to say the West was not wild. There was a really fascinating book by Robert Dykstra about the cattle towns in Kansas, trying to just statistically show how few, killings there were. but they're just wrong. It was incredibly, unbelievably violent. And that's why in every photograph you see, people are loaded down with weapons. I mean, not only did you have just the innate violence of outlaws and lawmen and people that are, I mean, you want to travel from, Albuquerque to El Paso, outlaws could kill you, Apaches could kill you just for nothing. I mean, to take your horse, I mean, and no one's ever going to find your body, and there's never going to be any repercussions. So it's just, you've got that, but then you also have the racial violence against Native peoples, and vice versa, and racial violence against the Chinese, racial violence against Hispanics, labor violence that's going on. It's an incredibly violent period in American history, just to begin with. 630,000 people killed in 5 years in the American Civil War, 4 years, excuse me. And these are people this is a generation numbed by violence. And so these soldiers from the Civil War, many of them go west, build the railroad, establish the towns, become buffalo hunters. Violence is the very first thing they turn to if there's any kind of dispute. So yeah, I just think the West really was very wild.
Yeah, I completely agree with Paul. It's very well said. One thing that surprised me as I was researching this book on Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and I thought it was very telling that every one of these boomtowns, whether it was a cattle boomtown like Wichita or Dodge City, or whether it was Deadwood, a mining boomtown, or Tombstone, every one of them had anti-gun laws. Those anti-gun laws are there for a reason. They were violent. I mean, innocent people could get killed in these spats with a gambler or drunken cowboys. And, of course, it was up to Wyatt Earp and his fellow officers to disarm these cowboys. And, Ed Masterson, the marshal of Dodge City, was mortally wounded disarming a cowboy. Marshal White in Tombstone, mortally wounded disarming Curly Bill Brocious. And then just speaking of Tombstone, I mean, there was a miner who was killed because he was upset that they were teasing him over his shirt. And he got into a fight because the people, they didn't like his new shirt that he bought. And his best buddy ended up killing him over his shirt. So, yeah, it could be very violent.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you're also like on an island of civilization among more violence in a sense, right? Like you live on these violent islands. That's the way I kind of look at the frontier, where if you get off the island, you're really in the middle of more danger. So there's no escaping it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that impressed me about Wyatt Earp was that he was very good at disarming. Of course, his technique was to slam him in the head with a gun barrel, which is a lot better than killing him. But the Dodge City newspapers praised Earp and his boss, the actual marshal, and said, one year we haven't even had a shooting scrape. And they said that was because of the good job that they were doing at taking the guns away from these guys. There was another article, I think it was 1879, and there's only been 2 deaths this summer, and the police force has had to practice on oyster tins to keep up their gun skills.
Oh, wow.
So, if you had a good lawman who was brave, you could tamp down and take away those guns. But it was for those lawmen, it was a very dangerous job.
What do you guys think finally tamed the Wild West? And how inevitable was that?
It's population. It's more people coming in. Of course, we do see the end of the Indian Wars. Geronimo surrenders in 1886, and and that's huge because that just everyone can recognize the great wrongs that are done to Native peoples. Everyone can recognize that their land was being taken. And all of this was unfair. But it really didn't matter if you were a settler, living out in the Dakotas or New Mexico, and people are being killed. You really didn't want to have a debate about who's right and who's wrong. You wanted to be safe. And I mean, one of the reasons I live in Cody, Wyoming, a wonderful community, is that I was tired of living in a community in which there were drive-by shootings every other day. I was just tired of it. I was tired of the crime and just tired of the whole atmosphere that went on there. And people felt that way. They wanted to clean up their communities, and that's why lawmen like Wyatt Earp were so important. And it's so great that it then morphs into entertainment. Cody makes it into a show. The Western movies, celebrated. Come back, Shane. Come back.
Great movie.
I mean, it was tamed just by people coming in. I mean, and such a cliche. The school marm comes in. She founds the school. Owen Wister's the Virginian. He's got to go down and face Trampas. A man's got to do what a man's got to do. Don't go. She begs. He goes down. He kills him. He brings peace to the community. Marries the school marm to live happily ever after. All right, so that's women tamed the West in many ways, and families, but it took time. I mean, it took hundreds of years to end the conflict that is the story of the American West. It's the birth of a nation, and birth can be difficult.
Yeah, every one of these boom towns, they just have that wide open period where it starts, and there's gunplay, and there's prostitution, but every one of them, they all want to grow up. They all want to leave that behind at some point, whether it's Wichita and then it's Dodge City, Deadwood. They all go through those growing pains. But as you have families and children, you don't want that violence. Again, you have all those city ordinances, no guns in town, and for good reason. There was an article in Dodge City. They made a big deal about how they built a new schoolhouse and playground. Guess where they built it? On Boot Hill. They took all those bodies and moved them to a different cemetery. And the newspaper showed it as, this is a sign of civilization. We're going past those days. We have a brand new schoolhouse for our children, and those places were fun for the lawbreakers and gamblers for a while, but it never lasted because the people that settled there didn't want that forever. They wanted it to go away eventually.
A couple of things here too. When I think of the West, when I used to teach my students about this, they always ask me, where does the West start? I'm talking early 1700s, and then we get to early 1800s. I talk about Andrew Jackson in Tennessee, and that's the West. And they're like, where is the West? I'm like, well, the United States continuously changes. But when they always ask me for the definition of the West, it was always difficult for me to say this is the West, because the West was different in different time periods in American history. If someone said, where is the West? What is the quintessential American West? What would we point to?
Well, there's the West as geography, and that's what geographers do. They establish regions, but then there's the West as place and process. And so that West begins in Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. I mean, John Smith is kind of a cowboy in armor, and it begins down in Santa Fe and Taos with the conquistadors coming up in 1540, for heaven's sake, long before Jamestown. And so all of these Wests, will finally converge, and technology has a lot to do with defining what the West is. Of course, it takes almost 200 years to get to the Mississippi River, and then it takes a generation to close the West. I mean, that's how quick the so-called Wild West period was. It really was from the Civil War to 1900. But they had really just started pushing, past the Mississippi in the 1820s and 1830s. And so it was a very ill-defined place. I think most people today would say it's the Mississippi River. They got the Gateway Arch. Of course, in my book, my book begins in the forests of Pennsylvania in 1750. And so I'm not saying the West begins there, but that's where my story begins, because I see the frontier as a process. And I see James Fenimore Cooper as a Western novelist. The Last of the Mohicans is a Western novel. I see Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone as quintessential Western heroes. Even though, Boone just gets across the river into Missouri, Crockett gets down to San Antonio. Bad personal choice in travel, but excellent career choice in becoming an American legend. And so we still define the West today. I kind of define where the West begins as DFW Airport between Dallas and Fort Worth. That's a pretty clear line. Dallas keeps trying to pretend, it's Boston and has class, and Fort Worth has the stockyards and embraces its cowboy past, So, and people in Texas, debate endlessly, and political pundits debate endlessly. Oh, is Texas part of the South or is Texas part of the West? Well, it's both. It's both. It's a big place, but nobody argues that Wyoming is not the West or Montana,
yes,
West, or the Dakotas are not the West. New Mexico is the West. So, that definition changes over time.
Yeah.
Yep. In the early 1900s, there was a meeting of state governors, and that discussion came up, where does the West begin? And there was a Denver newspaper reporter who read about this question in this meeting. His name was Arthur Chapman, and he wrote a poem called Out Where the West Begins, where basically he's saying it's a state of mind. It's like out where the hand clasp is a little firmer, out where you can make friends without half trying. That's where the West begins. So really, for him and a lot of people, it's a state of mind, where the West begins.
Great commercial right now on television for Tecovas boots. And a little kid is in a train, and a cowboy is racing the train, and he's looking out the window. And the narrator goes, "We may not need more people in the West, but we could sure use more of the West in the people." And I just think that's a wonderful, magnificent tagline. Whoever that advertising writer is, who needs to get some kind of award. I mean,
some bonus for that one. When I think of the West, and we are in 2026, and we're still talking about it, and we're still reading the books about it, and America is still fascinated with the West, and it's not going anywhere. Why do you think that is?
I mean, it's part of our DNA. It's actually part of our language. Joe Rogan Experience, and I hear him all the time. He'll say, "Yeah, it's the Wild West out there," or are we going to have the? I mean, we're talking about, that's the term we use to connect to something that's kind of, like we were talking about, violent, wild, crazy. It's the Wild West or whatever. And there was a news story just last year, and I couldn't believe this. There's a news story. There was a guy in Georgia who was being tried for murder. He was a police officer, and his defense attorney compared him to Wyatt Earp. He said, and the guy, he was acquitted. It's like, that's the power of this imagery. We're still using Wyatt Earp as this exemplary lawman who's protecting us all.
Wow.
Well, it is the foundational story of America. It's how disparate people from all over the world have come together to form a shared culture. It is how we identify ourselves and how Europeans and others look upon us. It's our Camelot, it's our Troy, and the figures from the Wild West, become our Hector and Achilles, our King Arthur. I mean, these are larger than life figures, and it's a story that it really explains American exceptionalism, that how different we are from other peoples. It's what makes us unique. I mean, the very fact that we are such an amalgam of people from all over the world, I think, gives us great power. But something has to unite us. The story of the West can unite us and give us that kind of distinctive character that when our Olympic team goes out there wearing cowboy hats, or they should be, during some administrations, they wear little French berets, and that's a problem. But normally they're wearing cowboy hats, because that's who America really thinks we are. I mean, who Europe and the rest of the world really thinks we are. And so it's just intrinsic to the American story, and it'll never die.
Yeah. So my last question for you guys. You're approached by a Hollywood production company that says money is not a problem, and you have full, complete creative freedom to make a movie about anything you want for whatever budget you want. What do you guys go for?
Well, that will never happen because Mark and I are writers, and we writers are not respected at all in Hollywood. I would love to do, though, and in fact, I worked out in Hollywood for 2 years, writing a very good script that he paid us a lot of money for on Davy Crockett, and circumstances prevented that movie from being made. But I would love to do a Crockett story, and that would be kind of my dream project. And the reason that didn't get made is that the budget was just too high at the time.
Well, I mean, it all, just like Paul, it'll go back to a project I worked on. My book on the Northfield Raid of 1876, Shout All to Hell, was optioned by Sony Pictures Television as a miniseries. We had a script written by Eric Jendrison, who was the head writer for Band of Brothers. I helped him with it. I thought it was wonderful. Sony could just not convince anybody to take that on. And of course, this year is the 150th anniversary of the Northfield Raid, September 7th. I still think that would make an accurate one, a great film. Yeah, that's where I'd put all that money for selfish reasons.
Gentlemen, this was amazing. I truly appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.